On September 11th, 2025, Beth Ann Hardison, activist, asked Yara Shahidi, activist, in a Forbes interview on how she felt about her world right now. Yara answered honestly by saying she is terrified and would like a plan to fix it. I empathize in that no one should live in fear. In my opinion, this sounds like a plea for help. I want to help, but how? When Yara Shahidi was younger, she did an equality speech on October 19, 2018 at the Gleason Respect Awards. I argue this speech is the hypothesis to fix her world and to reduce her fear. In April 2024, I published my book on Amazon based on this hypothesis, showing that prevention will lead to equity and that equity will lead to equality. This hypothesis will fix the political, economic, and social problems in our world. This nonprofit, non-edited channel is a letter to Yara Shahidi in teaching Yara's hypothesis to the public in order to better our world. In the end, Yara Shahidi will get the Nobel Peace Prize for her hypothesis. Dear Yara Shahidi, Chapter 17, Violence Prevention. Dr. King was successful in his civil rights quest because he used nonviolent protests to get his point across the nation. He convinced the majority of the nation, a president and a Congress, to pass new federal laws for civil rights bills. During his campaign, Dr. King met with racism and violence. During his campaign, Dr. King met with racism and violence along the way. Okay. With all of that said, racism and violence are still present today. With racism and violence ever present on our television sets and in social media, how can Dr. King's dream come true? In the past few chapters, I found solutions to diminish racism and to incorporate the us-them into a Lamana Plus society with prevention. This chapter dives into the history of civilization itself through a science lens of today. New theories in an array of science fields show that societies at the time used preventable techniques to curb the state of violence. These same techniques can be used today in classrooms to establish equality for all. Violence has been on the decline, and Violence has been on the decline, and data set after data set across science disciplines show this to be true. If this is true, then why does the world feel so violent today? Humans of today are in an information age of 24/7 news. This means people are experiencing violence happening in other places all over the world right now, and in a way they couldn't before. All this information feeds a particular bias long known as all this information feeds a particular bias long known as to scientists called availability heuristic. For example, if a person saw several news reports on car thefts, then this person would think that there are a lot of vehicle thefts in their area than there really are. Humans judge risk and danger according to how quickly examples pop into their head. This type of thinking can also be for terrorist attacks, mass shootings, domestic terrorist attacks, murders, hate crimes, rapes, etc. Even though these violent acts are rare, a diet of news stories fool the human brain into thinking violence is much more prevalent than it really is. Why? This is because journalists do not report live from a country that is at peace. It is all about revenue and ratings because violence and sex grabs people's attentions. The information the news is covering, like violence, can make people keep their guard up because they do not want to become vulnerable to that situation, or in other words, be the next victim to a violent act. They are pushing fear, but looking at scientific data shows that this is not the case. Since the hypothalamus, the emotional center of the brain, is older than the rest of the brain, it starts to process the information first. Once the prefrontal cortex, the logical and newer part of the brain, starts processing the information by looking at the facts, then the person can calm down. The news is important, but again, if a person is not able to reason their way out of the fear, then they will be scared and paranoid that it might happen to them by becoming a victim to the phantom violence. There is a deterrent to There is a deterrent to prevent violence. The first answer to beat this fear is to teach the science on how to read the news better. The teacher can revisit past news coverages of violent acts and have the facts on what is truly happening with what is being shown. It is propaganda in a way. The students will know that violent events are heinous, but are truly rare. The next thing is by having ethic investigations into news networks pushing fear and the propaganda of fear. It is a business, and certain ethical guidelines are there for them to follow because they are not allocating the entire truth of the facts. They are misleading the public for ratings. This is propaganda, and it can lead to genocides, as stated before. This is why the news should be boring, because humans are literally dependent on information for survival. This is why the news will cover scientific journals for news, so people will understand the truth of what is real and not propaganda. Lastly, for the people who do not want to be the victim of violent crimes, then the solutions are Dr. King's dream of Lamont. Lastly, for the people who do not want to be the victim of violent crimes, then the solutions are Dr. King's dream and Lamana Plus being the new society for America, or a simpler approach would be for students to take self-defense classes from 2 years old to graduation. In this way, they will have the self-confidence to stand up for themselves. Another way is empathy, to prevent violence, as mentioned before. Another way is empathy, to prevent violence, as mentioned before with racism. Studies have shown that babies as young as 3 months old have empathy and can determine morality. Babies can see interactions between humans and determine who is nice and mean. Plus, babies can determine morality and fairness between the interactions of two humans. A series of studies found too much empathy can get in the way of making decisions. This causes the person to focus too much in one direction and leave out important additional information. For example, volunteers who heard about one person in need tended to want to help that person at the expense of others who were also in need. Plus, too much empathy can make a person especially loyal to someone. This in turn can make a person distrustful and exclusionary toward those people who they perceive as different. This can lead to biases. This is why empathy, when taught, needs for the individual to find balance through preventative psychology studies with the fMRI and AI. Since empathy, morality, and fairness are part of a human's biology, then they can be taught to enhance these abilities from 2 years old to graduation. They will become experts and advocates for this type of thinking. Another violent deterrent was government. Scientists studied over 600 populations between 50,000 years ago to today. The scientists showed that people 50,000 years ago suffered a violent death 3 times greater than today. The reason for this was if one small nomadic human group had something that another nomadic group didn't, like food, shelter, water, etc., then the potential for conflict or violence would occur. At around 10,000 years ago, when agriculture took off and populations grew, humans began to get rid of their small nomadic bands and formed governments. The first governments developed systems of rules to keep people in line and formed leaders for them to solve the problems of society. The early leaders really didn't want violence among their people because they needed soldiers, slaves, and taxpayers for conquest, money, and power. Violence among the people would have deprived the early leaders of these luxuries. Plus, the research shows that humans living in government societies had less rates of violence toward them than non-government societies. What does this mean for modern governments? When governments are transparent, less corrupt, and are strong and work for the people, then people are happier. The government that works this way is Denmark. A different deterrent for violence from history is that when scientists studied over 800 years of written records from the 13th century to the 20th century in Europe, they found that homicides went down from a rate of 1 homicide to every 1,000 people to 1 homicide to every 1 million people. Europe kept the best historic records more than any other continent at the time. Scientists call this downward trend of homicides the civilizing process. This is the idea that when societies become more interdependent, humans were penalized for behaving in a violent way against one another. In other words, people learned manners and were scolded for not acting properly. Commerce and business flourished during this time when ships bringing in goods from across the world. The theory explains that this new economic order went hand in hand with a set of social norms. In other words, violence was bad for business. If businesses wanted to trade, make money, and profit from it, then they pressured governments to prevent violence from happening. This in turn gave ordinary people better lives and incentives for rulers to grow their economy for their own power, conquest, and money. Manners contributed to a decline in violence, and the economics flourished because manners were a sign of self-control and people not acting on their impulses. According to research, daily life before manners had people having sex in public. They would put a gnawed bone back on the serving plate. They would smack their lips. They would drink from their plate. And they would go to the bathroom in public. Now with manners, these social norms were not allowed anymore. Plus, if someone insulted another person or stepped on their toe, then that person wouldn't pull out a knife and challenge that person to a fight. With a society full of manners, people now would hold their horses and count to 10 to calm down. This was the power of manners deterring violence. With manners contributing to more self-control in humans, then this contributes to more prefrontal cortex activity in the brain. This region of the brain is responsible for planning and controlling human impulses. Researchers scanned 41 murders and showed that they have poor prefrontal cortex activity in their brains. This shows that violent offenders have poor levels of self-control. Can researchers strengthen the prefrontal cortex and get rid of violent offenders for good? I don't know for good when it comes to violent offenders, but researchers can increase the activity in the prefrontal cortex by 30 to 40% by stimulating that area of the brain in stimulations to reduce criminal intent if provoked by another person. What does this all mean for humans today? Well, students can learn manners as a training tool for self-control. Plus, self-control classes and exercises need to be in school so that teachers and psychologists can see the progress in real time with simulations in order to see the calmness being shown if the students are provoked by another person. This will reduce criminal intent and violent offenders from being developed. This is the preventative process by reducing that outgroup told by the racist experts. This will prevent their existence. If a person from 2 years old to graduation practices a set of behaviors that engages areas of the brain which leads to improving behavior, then the behavior allows generations of students to further strengthen the area of the brain to reduce violence plagued by mankind for thousands of years. This process will finally contribute to humans living in peace without fear of being a victim to violence. This is a huge shift in our evolution as a species to take control of our destiny by finally breaking the confines of what Mother Nature has on us. We as humans can stop We as humans can start to write our own story for once, but always be grateful for letting Mother Nature develop us. Now, we as humans can be independent with science understanding and not so dependent on her anymore, for the most part. Another deterrent for violence from history that civilizations used was literacy. Literacy gave rise to ideas and empathy that made humans question things in the form of equality and science to reduce violence. When print spread around Europe, when print spread around Europe, the Bible motivated people to want to read it in the 17th and 18th centuries. Plus, the Bible was a book that people could hold in their hands as a means of being closer to their God. Once people acquired literacy, they moved from the Bible to other publications such as newspapers and novels. Newspapers help people recognize that there was somebody else in another city that was having the same experiences as they were. Print in newspapers was incredibly important because it created a broader sense of community to the average person. They were not alone. With novels, it allowed the reader to get inside the mind of the characters. The person sees what the character is doing, thinking, and feeling. The reader grows empathetic toward the character, like a person watching a movie today and cares what happens to that character through their adventures. The reader is allowed to enter into the characters' lives. They relate and react to the characters' adventures with their own understanding and experiences, as though they were living the character's life, so to speak. The scientific evidence shows that literacy gave rise to empathy, in which it helped abolish slavery. In the 15th through 19th centuries, 12 million people were forced into a transatlantic slave trade, and where the European and U.S. economies were built from. The daily life for slaves were awful and horrible because the slaves were worked to death. Psychological studies show that reading fiction can build a human's care for different groups of people who they might not care about. In other words, reading novels made people more empathetic. The reading of the mind in eye tests is a scientific experiment designed to test empathy. Participants are shown photographs of eyes and asked to guess the emotion. People who read novels scored higher on these tests. Reading a novel is like going to the empathy gym. Now, when people were reading novels that had slave narratives in the past, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, then the reader was brought into a world that amplified the humanity of the enslaved and by extension were deserving of freedom. The empathy that people felt from popularized slave narratives drove them to political action like the abolitionist movement. So cool. What is the scientific evidence that literacy gave rise to ideas in the form of science and equality to reduce violence? People in the past lived in an incredibly hierarchical society in which everyone lived in supremely rigid social classes, like a caste society. In other words, it was really hard for people to move up the social, political, and economic ladders of society. For example, upward mobility for people with economic means was really hard. If a person was poor, then they mostly stayed like that for the rest of their lives. With literacy came ideas of science reasoning that started to question the physical and social worlds. People started to rethink social and economic situations from the ground up. The science revolution in ideas drove people to ask underlying questions through observation, hypothesis, and experiment. When science took off, then it made people conduct more radical questions, and it made people think about other people, like slavery, women, and religious minorities. This empathy understanding through literacy and even through science reasoning, made people think about equality. During the 18th century, European thinkers started to really think about equality and freedom through scientific reasoning and empathy. This led to a system of arguments against slavery, cruel punishments, and imperialism. Jeez. I swear I read this before. Jeez. For example, the U.S. Constitution was made during this time, and it is full of sayings of equality, like all men are created equal. For example, the U.S. Constitution was made during this time, and it is full of sayings of equality, like all men are created equal. These ideas, in the form of science and equality, change people's attitudes towards physical violence. Capital punishments were torture in the past, and they were done in the public, right in front of people. Torture was a routine part of the law. In the mid-1700s, this type of jurisprudence began to lose favor in Western Europe because of the idea of equality. The evidence for this change comes from the Central Criminal Court of London. It accounts of 197,745 different trials from 16... Jeez. Okay. The evidence for this change comes from the Central Criminal Court of London. It has accounts of 197,745 different trials from 1674 to 1913. Yay. Jeez. It is the largest body of speech anywhere in the world. These records are hard evidence of a culture shift away from interpersonal violence. People became much less tolerant of violence. The evidence shows a decline of homicides from the court cases, a retreat from torture, and a cultural shift in attitudes away from violence toward each other. As manners did before, literacy gave rise to ideas like scientific reasoning and equality by reducing violence through empathetic understanding for other people. How does this help people today? Well, 3 things can be done about this. First, students have to learn this type of history to understand how humans received these ideas from the circumstances that these humans lived through. First, students have to learn this type of history to understand how humans received these ideas from the circumstances of these humans, of how First, students have to learn this type of history to understand how humans received these ideas from the circumstances that these humans lived through in the past, so that history doesn't repeat itself. Yay! Jeez. Next is empathy, from the novels to movies and the monopress spectrum. This should be required because human societies have cultural shifts from literacy toward other people because of empathy. To continue with this type of thinking, students today should watch the 110 movies needed to see in their lifetime and the 30 books that everyone should read once in their lives. The last thing is students need to know how to achieve scientific reasoning as their established knowledge base. Students need to learn science, read science journals, and do projects through a science lens of a hypothesis, experiment, and duplicate to establish fact under an ethic foundation of law from 2 years old to graduation in every subject in school, like they do on Science Girls on PBS. In Science Girls, they do scientific experiments for preteens for school, like dolphin dive. In this way, then equality for all can happen and Dr. King's dream can come true. The data that has been used and told in this chapter so far has been mostly about Europe, But what about the rest of the world on the idea to reduce violence? The data that was presented earlier before by Europeans acquiring cultural shifts through manners and literacy by obtaining empathy toward their fellow man through scientific reasoning and equality impacted the world also. In the last 500 years, European philosophy, economics, and political systems have spread around the world, and it had a massive impact. Worldwide, the data shows that rates of death and warfare had gone down over the centuries. Don't get me wrong, people still got killed with the wars being waged during these 500 years, but Earth's population had grown exponentially over that time. Even when wars are devastating to a populace or to a country, the amount of people that lived war-free through those 500 years were in the millions and billions of people toward the beginning of the 21st century. Even though World War II killed 66 million people, there were 2.3 billion people on the planet at that time. The number of people getting killed is proportional to the world's population. But by this metric, World War II was significant, but it was nothing compared to the 13th century Mongol conquest. The Mongol conquests were launched by Genghis Khan, and it killed 40 million people. This accounted for 10% of the world's population. The reason why violence has slowed down today on a massive scale is because the big national armies are not fighting each other like Russia and the US and NATO. There are wars from smaller countries, but these wars would be nothing if the United States and Russia sent their nuclear weapons at each other. What this means in the end is that the data shows that every known form of warfare has gone down because of literacy and manners, producing cultural shifts toward empathy and equality worldwide. Besides literacy and manners, science shows that humans have gone through a self-domestication as well to help reduce violence and to get along with each other. In the 1950s, scientists took a population of wild foxes and they wanted to see if they could breed them solely for tameness, like a wolf becoming a dog through human breeding processes over thousands of years. This experiment wanted to find out if tameness could be acquired from a wild animal at a faster pace. The scientists took the friendliest foxes, for the most part, and bred those together. When scientists breeded the most docile foxes in each generation, they ended up with something that looked remarkably like a domesticated dog. The fox's behavior changed, and so did their physical appearance. The fox's skull became shorter and proportionally wider. The new shape of their skull appeared to go along with decreased aggression. The scientists proved that a wild fox could be domesticated with tameness in a short period of time. What does this have to do with humans? Now, with humans, self-domestication hypothesis explains that there was a natural selection process against aggressiveness that took place over the last several 100,000 years. This means that humans have become less violent than our past ancestors, and it continues today. To test this hypothesis, human skulls were gathered across 200,000 years. The skulls were tested for testosterone, and this hormone is linked to aggression and violence. Humans are aggressive animals and have the same limbic system or emotional center like mammals. Violence across the animal kingdom is committed by males, and it is something humans do as well. For example, the U.S. arrest data shows for assault, 76.7% were males, 23.3% were females. For rape, 97.2% were males, and 2.8% were females. And for murders, 87.5% were males, and 12.5% were females. Human males are linked to violence across human evolution. The evidence from the skulls show that testosterone levels have gone down over the past 200,000 years. This shows that males have become less aggressive over time. Even though males and even females have shown aggressive behaviors over the years, there are also peaceful. Even though males and females and even females have shown aggressive behaviors over the years, they are also peaceful by nature as well. The reality is that humans are both peaceful and aggressive at the same time. Again, if prevention is used, then humans can use peaceful means more often than aggressive ones through brain scans, as mentioned before. The brain scans can help humans produce empathy and use their prefrontal cortex more often to be more sociable toward each other. This is the true piece of Lamana Plus. This is the true piece of Lamana Plus by producing Dr. King's dream. The last thing that needs to be said about violence prevention is that violence was an important tool in human history in trying to get things done. By the 20th century, humans were moving into a world where that tool was less and less effective. Violence doesn't pay off as much with the recent rise of nonviolent protests like Gandhi's Salt March. In March 1930, Gandhi drew in hundreds of thousands of Indians to walk 200 miles to the sea, and where it had a profound effect on people's understanding what nonviolent action could achieve. Since 1900, there were over 300 cases of nonviolent resistance movements around the world, including the civil rights movement by Dr. King. Dr. King was inspired by Gandhi and his nonviolent movement, and it mostly succeeded in getting rid of racism and segregation in the United States. The success rates of nonviolent mass movements are about twice that for violent campaigns. The resistance has been paralleled with an example. The success rates of nonviolent mass movements. The success rates of nonviolent mass movements are about twice that for violent campaigns. This resistance has been paralleled with an expansion of human rights. The adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 set a new goal for the world at the United Nations. This Universal Declaration changed the worldview for the world because humans couldn't enslave anybody and humans couldn't wage wars that devastated people by the millions. In the end, violence prevention will always come down to schools. Schools are the perfect places to mold young minds into the Lamana Plus society humans have always dreamed about. The tools of science and technology in the here and now can and should be used to get rid of racism from the individual for good. Teaching nonviolent marches in schools should be required for students to understand and do if their elected leaders in their time do not do what is right for them. Government is an institution that works for the people, and if the politicians of now and in the future don't do that, then students would have learned about nonviolent marches in schools that they march and protest until their demands are met. Dr. King knew how to do nonviolent marches well because he was successful in his quest after watching his idol Gandhi do the same with his march 30 years before. Government is going to screw up, and this is inevitable because it is made up of flawed humans. Nonviolent protests help that mistake by putting pressure on government officials to make it right. When all the politicians grew up with a Lamana Plus society with empathy, literacy, manners, scientific reasoning, and the understanding of history, then they will work toward a more profound government. If they don't, then millions of students who grew up with Lamana Plus will make their voices heard in a non-violent protest across the world for a better tomorrow, for equality for all. The one that I have to grow, the one that I have to throw, the one that I have to throw in is what Superman said in Man of Steel. Now every human on Earth can be a force for good. In the end, we all want equality for all. Wow, that was a little hard to read. Jeez, maybe I'm having a bad day. Ich ni san shi go kuchu. Konnichiwa, laloon, wee wee. Sometimes you just can't always get the perfect video. Hola, buenos dias, adios. We all went together. De nada.